It's a joy to obey the Lord who has commanded us by saying, give to the Lord glory and strength. Give to the Lord glory due unto his name. When we tell the world how good God is and how he has helped us throughout lifetime, it gives him glory, it gives him credit. We often hear people say when something bad happens, people say, where was God? Well, we often don't remember to thank God when things go well. I want to talk to you today, just you, the viewer. Let's pretend that you and I are together having a cup of tea, and I want to share with you my life story. It is a story where the Lord took what was an impossible life to be used, and he has done great things. The Bible says, in the day of trouble, call upon me, and I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me. By my telling you about how he has delivered me from so many hopeless situations, I am glorifying him. That is, giving him the credit for the good that he has done. In the Bible, we read about women who prayed God would give them sons, but never do you read about a woman asking for a daughter. This is how we think in Asia. The Bible talks mainly about the people in Israel, which is in Asia, into that type of a culture that lacked sons. I was born as a girl to a Buddhist family. We were so poor that we lived in a hole in the ground. We didn't have a bathroom, no kitchen. We had maybe one kettle on top of 2 piles of rocks. That was our kitchen. Sometimes we would have a soybean plant to steam in it, but usually we had nothing. The whole outside was our bathroom. We went wherever, whenever, and we didn't know anything else existed. So now, one of the ways I can measure how God has been good to me is that I started my life with no bathrooms, and now I have multi-toilets to keep clean at my home. Also, even at the orphanage, I used to go around feeling the floor for extra grains of rice that the older children may have dropped on the floor, because I was the youngest one, and I would hope that I could find some grains of rice that they had dropped on the floor. Now, God has been so good to me, I have to schedule when to diet. When the North Korean communists invaded us South Koreans in June of 1950, I must have been about 3 years old. Now, mind you, we don't know exactly my month of birth and so forth, long confused story, but as close as we can figure, probably May of 1947. We saw many new exciting things, however, when the war broke out, because above us there were airplanes coming, and they would drop noisy bombs, which to me was very exciting. I had never heard such a thing before. I remember seeing a truck that had pretty trees inside. I was born with sight, and with a lot of curiosity. So I'd go around looking at all these things. I thought they were pretty trees. Years later, I deduced that that was probably camouflaging some ammunitions, but I didn't know that. My Korean daddy told us not to look at the bombs when the bombs would fall. But because I was just 3 years or so, and with a lot of curiosity, I instinctively looked at the bomb, lost most of my sight by doing that. The Bible says, children, obey your parents, for this is right in the Lord. But keep in mind, I didn't know yet that there was a Bible. I didn't know there was a God who had spoken in that book called the Bible. But there's consequences of disobeying your dad. And at this point, I always drive home for the children. It should be taught to you that you should obey your dad because it's good for you. We joined the millions of refugees running away from the communists because the North Korean communists were pushing us southward, hoping all the way to shove us into the Sea of Japan. The only good thing that happened in those endless days was when American soldiers would throw out from jeeps their candy bars, chocolate bars. We used to say, chocoreto. Well, there were way too many orphans on those dirt roads and not enough jeeps of American soldiers. Years later, again, I figured out they had been sharing with us their own meals when they threw those chocolate bars out. One day, somehow, my dad got a bite of that chocolate, and I thought it was so good when he gave me one bite. We walked and walked and walked, and wherever and whenever the day ended, we would sleep on the ground. One morning, way early, Daddy took Mom and my baby sister and me out to a river after we had spent one night at somebody's dirt room. He thought it would be best if we could die quickly instead of starving to death slowly. Keep in mind, we were beggars, literal beggars. Well, people say, well, he must have snapped. No, I think he was really trying to spare us from something that was just so hopeless. We were Buddhists. We didn't have a home. We didn't have clothes. We didn't have food. He saw no way of getting any. So he threw my baby sister and me to drown in the river. Somehow, I didn't fear that water. When you're not afraid of the water, God's design is that you stay afloat, not sink down in and drown. The Bible puts it this way in Isaiah 43. It says, "Fear not, I have redeemed thee, thou art mine. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee." At this point, I usually have the audience repeat, "River shall not overflow me." That principle is true in your own life too. And your flood or river may not be an actual physical water in the ground, but it may be financial trouble, relationship trouble, health trouble. But if we will remember God's promise, we, the Christian, can know that he will go through the river with us and keep us from drowning. Mom's frantic screams from the river's bank, wanting her children, caused my daddy to come back to rescue us. The baby sister, who was probably 2 years old, had already washed away somewhere. I was the only one that Dad could rescue out of the river. He put me on the river's bank where there was grass, I remember. When he threw us in the river, it was way early in the morning. I know because I could still see partially, and the moon was on the surface of the water. And I hit a few rocks in the river, and then when he took me out and put me on the river's bank, I threw up a bunch of water, and then I realized my left eye began to swell when the sun came out. By that time, the sun was out. So I don't know how long I was in the river. But the sun felt so hot, and it made the eye swell and felt like a marble. And I thought, if I could just reach and pull that thing out. Years later, my friends and I figure that in the river, I should have kept my eyes closed. But I didn't know any better. I was too small. So I probably kept my eyes opened, and no telling what kind of germs went in at that point. Mom said goodbye to me that day because she had to find her own food by herself, because even 3 was too big a crowd to beg for. Somehow, my dad found out about an orphanage that American missionaries had. He took me to that orphanage and left me there. It was a sad time when he had to leave me there. I thought, I can't stand this. Well, Bible has a verse for that too. Psalm 27:10, it says, when my father and mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. God's taking me up began to really take off when my earthly parents had to give me up. When the truce was signed, American missionaries were returning to Korea. They would hold lots of revivals, and they would ask me to sing. People ask me, well, how long have you sung? I said, well, as long as my mouth could open. And that's when I started singing, and I've always liked singing. We didn't have toys. I didn't have anything else to do but sing. So I would sing. And on another thing that happened really good at the orphanage is that the missionaries told us God so loved this world that God sent his only begotten Son, Jesus, and that whosoever would believe in that Son of God, Jesus, should not perish but have everlasting life. I wanted that everlasting life. But what I did not know was that I could have the assurance that Jesus had died for me, because I thought Americans were good enough people that Jesus would die for them. The soldiers were so good to us. The missionaries were so good to us. I could see Jesus would die for them. But I couldn't figure out that Jesus had died for me personally. Here I was, a girl in a culture that really wanted boys, blind, beggar, orphan, a Korean, a poor one at that. So all these things would make one feel so insignificantly. But God had a great plan. The Bible says, call unto me and I'll answer thee and show thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not. Well, missionaries who heard my singing at their revivals and so forth got the vision to send me to America. Also, I have to tell you, when the missionaries took me to that orphanage, one of the first things they did was to put me into the hospital to get this left eye taken out. Well, that was the first time I ever saw a bed. I guess maybe I was 4 years old by then, not sure. But when I was awakened from the surgery, they had taken both out. When I went back to the orphanage from the hospital, I felt like I was behind a wall, and which I could, if I could just push that wall down, I could see the little bit of light and darkness again, a little bit of color. But I couldn't, there was no wall that I could push down. Eventually, your body can get accustomed to anything, they tell me. The sockets were empty about 10 years. And years later, here in America, as an 8th grader, I began to wear plastic eyes, because you might think, looking at me, you might think, well, you got eyes in your sockets. What are those? These are plastic eyes. And the first time the eye doctor put some eyes in, when I was in the 8th grade in Indianapolis, I fainted. It was so uncomfortable. Gradually, he increased the size. And one time I had a brown one in here and blue one in there. And before that first year at School for the Blind was over, he got some out of his drawer and shaved to the shape. And he said, this is your permanent pair. I said, okay, well, good. But 10 years later, I met a custom eye maker in Chicago. He said, well, I don't imagine you've been too comfortable in these. I said, well, but I was told it would be my permanent pair. He said, yeah, but he said, I would tell you, you must have had a lot of discomfort because you've been wearing American eyeballs and Korean sockets. So from then on, I get custom-made eyes. Oh, back to the orphanage day. One of the many good things that happened was we developed memory. Now, people all around the world have asked me, how do you memorize so much? Can you tell us a secret? I have no secret other than organized repetition. So what God used mostly for developing my memory is the Bible itself. By and by, the orphanage obtained all the Braille volumes of the New Testament in Korean Braille. We would have kids taking turns using that. For instance, I would have the book of John to memorize chapters 13 through 17 in one day, one night until the next night. Then that volume would go to another kid in line, and I might get Matthew for the next 24 hours to memorize chapters 1 through 7. The good thing is no teacher told us that that was impossible. And I thank God that nobody told us it was impossible. Because I like challenges, I like memorizing, I love learning, and I like winning. We would have citywide competition, and whoever said the passages most accurately got a prize. The prize was ink print of the New Testament in Korean. Well, of course, I couldn't read it, but I liked winning. The Lord was training my memory. Now, mind you, I don't know if anybody else in the orphanage managed or not. That wasn't my business. My business was to do what they set for me to do. And looking back, the Lord was so good to develop my memory. And even before I was taken to the orphanage, I remember my Korean dad telling people that her head is good, and I thought he meant her hair is pretty. I didn't know that meant brains. But I'm thankful to God that God used the best thing with which to develop memory, which is his own words, the Bible. Well, I sang at everything missionaries asked me to sing, but I didn't know for sure I too could have the assurance of salvation, but I wanted to go to heaven. When the missionaries gave my name to Holt Adoption Agency for adoption, I came to America at the age of 10, Thanksgiving of 1957. 2 years later, October of 1959, Billy Graham's team held a month-long crusade in Indianapolis. There, Mr. Graham said one night, "If Jesus were to return in the next thunder, would you be ready to meet him?" I was afraid I wasn't ready. I wanted to be, but I didn't know that I could have the personal assurance that Jesus had died for me, who had been a Korean, begging, orphan girl, blind. When Mr. Graham said, I too could have the assurance of knowing Jesus would live inside me, if I would invite him in, then I would be sure of heaven. I went forward, invited Jesus into my heart. I would ask you that question, viewer. If Jesus were to come in the next thunder, would you be ready? And he is coming soon. Then 4 years later, I gave my life for full-time Christian service at Winona Lake, Indiana, when Bob Pierce spoke for Oriental Mission Society. Well, after I did that, I had second thoughts. I thought, oh no, I don't know if I should have done that. Because back then, somehow, we thought missionary, we thought full-time Christian service meant becoming a missionary. And missionary meant you had to go to Africa and starve in a mud hut. And I thought, hey, I started my life starving in a hole in the ground in Korea, and I don't want to end my life starving in Africa. I told that to the Methodist youth worker in town in Dayton, Indiana. His name was Bob. He said, Kim, there are those of us who would give our right arm to do what you can do. Well, I didn't know what he meant, but I took that as an encouraging statement that I had done okay by giving my life for full-time service. By that time, we had spent 2 years at public school in Indiana and then 3 years at Indiana School for the Blind. Even in Korea, I had gone 3rd grade and 6th grade in public school because the missionaries wanted me to show that a blind could compete with the sighted. Well, here in America, first 2 years when I went to public school, Mom Wickes read me the assignments in the evening, but then we adopted another one from Korea, and she was busy, so I went to School for the Blind, 8th, 9th, and 10th grades. By that time, my American dad and I felt like maybe I needed to go to an environment where I would compete with the sighted people. I wanted an academically challenging environment. We found that by finding out about Wheaton Academy in Wheaton, Illinois, because at that Winona Lake, there was a table by Wheaton College, and in that catalog was a paragraph about the sister school, which was Wheaton Academy. We wrote there. Principal called us and said, we have never had a blind person, but if you would like to come up and talk, we will give it a try. It seems like God's way is that we think about things and talk about things, and then all of a sudden, the next step happens. Suddenly we have to zoom up. Just like the children of Israel, they knew for centuries that there was a promised land to which they would go. But when it was time to go, they had to hurry and go in one night. And that's how it is with my life, too. For instance, when I left Korea to be adopted to America, there had been talks that I would be sent to the States. But all of a sudden, it was time to go. And there hadn't been time to learn much English. Mrs. Hill, who began the orphanage where I was, had told me, just as I was leaving Cheongju to go to Seoul for America, she said, now this, I'm backtracking a little, she said, I had wanted to spend 6 weeks with you to prepare you for America, tell you some things about culture, how they eat with a fork and a knife instead of chopsticks, and teach you some more English. All I knew was first verse of Jesus Loves Me. I knew how to count. I could say, my name is so-and-so, but that's about all we knew. But there wasn't time to prepare, and that seems to be how God works in the life of his children who have to live by faith. But Mrs. Hill gave me a life's verse, and I must tell you that, and backtrack a little. She said, when you go to America, she said, take with you this verse for life. Isaiah 42, verse 16, where God says to Israel, and it will be true in the millennium, for right now, for us Christian, we can take it as devotionally for us. It says, God says, I will bring the blind by a way that they knew not. I will lead them in paths that they have not known. I will make darkness light before them, and crooked places, crooked things straight. These things will I do unto them, and not forsake them. Mrs. Hill said, put your name in where it talks to the blind. Say, God is saying to you, I will lead Kim Wickes, which was going to be my new name, in a way that she knew not. I will lead Kim Wickes by a way that she has not known. Well, at that time, of course, I did it in Korean name. But anyway, that has been one of my life verses. Sometimes there's been nothing to do except remind God, you promised me, Lord, you would lead me in ways and make crooked things straight before me all the time. Now, after I gave my life for full-time Christian service as a 16-year-old, and I went to Wheaton Academy and ended up at the super good class of 1965, and I'm not just talking. As one of my Louisiana friends used to say, I ain't just a woofin'. It's really super class. If you talk to anybody from Wheaton Academy, they'll all say to you, oh yes, we know about that class of 1965. That was a special class. That was an answer to prayer because I was asking for a supernatural and academically challenging environment. Now, in that 2 years of high school, last 2 years of high school, I again had to figure out how to function among the sighted people. I had to humble myself, figure out what I needed. Well, it takes some humility to admit that you need help. Bible says before honor is humility. Since I couldn't see and nobody at the academy had worked with the blind before, I had to figure out what I needed. Then I would ask different friends to read me the assignments every day. Then as they would read, I would take Braille notes. After the lights out at 10 p.m. in the dorm, because the dorm at Wheaton was 160 miles away from my American parents, I would study the notes that I had accumulated during the day. And that's the MO, modus operandi, whereby I functioned all through school. Keep in mind, we didn't have the technology that's available today. And that's how I functioned through high school, also college. I went 1 year to Wheaton College and then transferred back to Indiana University as a sophomore, where I had already spent the summer before senior year in high school. I had gotten a scholarship that summer of '64 and taken all the freshman courses in music and really had a fun time. I couldn't believe that was school. It was fun to me to study music. Then after 7 years of school, starting sophomore, which included Bachelor of Music in Voice Performance, that was 2 recitals, and then 2 recitals at master's level. Then I did 4 recitals and the coursework for doctorate, but I did not do the thesis and the orals. I did not complete the degree, but I went on a Fulbright scholarship to Vienna, Austria, where they told me I was the first foreign student that didn't have to take German. Now here's an illustration of how God can turn a bad into good. Because I had to have people read to me all the assignments, and I liked German. I loved German from the first time I came to America. I liked hearing the German children's choir, who would come to Purdue University, and the music director at Purdue would give my parents and me free tickets to hear the choir. And I used to write to some of those kids. Because I liked German, I took German by correspondence in Braille from Hadley Correspondence School in Illinois. Well, I didn't know it was supposed to be a 2-year course. I took it in 9 months. Then when I was a senior in high school, I also took biology by correspondence from that school. And Hadley School for the Blind made me the Student of the Year in '65. They called it School of Courage. And I tell you that because having to depend on readers, especially by Indiana University time, when I went to graduate level of German, because I liked it. Now, voice majors had to take just 1 semester in foreign language, including German, but I already knew that, so I kept taking German. Well, the more advanced I got, of course, the more difficult it was to find readers. But the last couple years there, my reading friend was the wife of a graduate student from Germany. Well, the wife did not know any English. So God used that for me to learn German like a German, to communicate with her. So when I got to Vienna, they said, the staff there said, faculty I guess, they said, well, you're the first foreign student who won't have to take German because you talk so well and I can see you talk a lot. So they said, we know you'll get a lot of practice. In Vienna, I saw firsthand the missionaries at work. And at this point, I always like to say, it's interesting that I began my life by helping the missionaries in Korea. They used to pick me up when I was just 4 or 5 years old. The missionaries would pick me up in their Jeep, and oh, that gasoline smells so bad. And I'd get car sick. But I would help the missionaries sing. I would sing, and they would share the gospel in the weed wilderness of South Korea, and that's how they spread the gospel. And I've done that all my life, even at Indiana University. In addition to what I studied in music school and other stuff, I would find a song, find somebody to dictate words and music. I would transcribe it to Braille, memorize it, and sing each Sunday. Well, I did that in Vienna, too. I would help the missionaries who wanted to start churches at different districts. And if they wanted me to sing at a different district, I would sing for them. So I got to thinking, all my life, I've been in that narrow road, if you will. Yes, God can straighten out a messed up life, but it is better to stay or start in the right road and stay on that. I think my life's ministry can be described by the Psalms where it says, I will praise thee, O Lord, among the people. I will sing unto thee among the nations. In Vienna, the last Sunday there, I gave a whole concert in German, of course, and it was so funny. Even I know that my Redeemer liveth from the Messiah, which Handel composed in England, so it was originally in English, but to have Austrians understand the message, I did even that. I know that my Redeemer liveth in German. Well, when you minister, you want the people to understand the message. Now, during that Fulbright year of 73-74, I spent the Christmas vacation time by taking a train to Schloss Mittersill, which was run by InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. There, one of the people who was taking Christmas vacation was Paul Little. Before he spoke, before one of the services, I played and sang O Holy Night. He got up and he said, well, some of us got more talents than others did. Well, after he spoke, I visited with him. I found out that he was involved in planning the Lausanne Congress, International Congress on World Evangelization. I didn't know that was even being planned. Billy Graham's team was organizing it. But here, God already had me next door because Lausanne is in Switzerland. I was in Vienna the whole previous year, right next door in Austria. I was selected to spend another year in Vienna, but God had plans, and I wanted to start singing and start cutting down some of the college loans. I wrote to Dr. Francis Schaeffer during that year, and I said, I am willing to do anything that God wants me to do, even typing or maybe sing on weekends only. Dr. Schaeffer's response was, he said, that's good you're willing, but my observation has been that God keeps you in the path that he has chosen and usually will continue where you are. Then Cliff Barrows heard from Paul Little that I had been at the castle, and God worked it out that Cliff Barrows invited me to sing at the Lausanne Congress. Now, mind you, when I invited Jesus into my heart in 1959, I met Cliff Barrows and Billy Graham and the team, and I sang for them. In fact, Cliff was one of the first ones to whom I wrote a letter in English on typewriter. Other than to Mrs. Hill, the orphanage founder in Korea, Cliff was the first one to whom I wrote. And he used to use my letters to him, he said, as part of the family devotion. Because Cliff had invited me to sing, then I sang at Lausanne Congress. And here, right before I went to Lausanne, I went back to that castle near Salzburg. Stacy Woods, who was running that InterVarsity castle, he said, some of you are desperate, not knowing what your next step in life is. And I knew one of the ones he was talking to was about me. Before I left that castle, Schloss Mittersill, he and Mrs. Woods and I talked and prayed in their room. He said, I believe God's going to use your life with your music and your testimony. And he said, you will probably tell your story all over the world. But because by then I already had a ticket to come around the world a long way, back to America after the Fulbright. But he said, I believe North America will be your main focal point of operation. Thinking back, he was so correct, and that was correct prophecy. And that's exactly what's happened. It's been a walk by faith, invitation by invitation. And I used to think, well, my last invitation is only 6 months ahead, and God, what next? But God always provided. At this point, I would like to thank everybody who can still see and hear me. In looking back, I think, Father God, you are so good to always find somebody who would host me in their home, or if I were put in a motel, who would pick me up, take me to meals, to church. So I would like to thank everyone who has ever fed me, and I eat a lot. Jim and Jamie will testify, I eat a lot when there's food available. And anybody who has given me rides, I thank you. And anybody who has done anything, especially praying for me. Thank you so much. The longer I live, it seems like the fewer there are on the planet who can still pray, because many of them have promoted to heaven. So I want to thank those of you who have had a part.